Hello, my name is Arik Korman, Communications Director with the League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series over 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today we will hear from David Lewis, Director and Program Manager of Behavioral Health Services at Seattle Public Schools, on how ACEs and complex trauma impact student learning. David will speak for about 20 minutes, and we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. The focus of today's webinar will be on what ACEs and complex trauma is, how best to identify and support ACEs students, and best teaching practices. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a chat function on the right side of your screen. This is a space for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us at info@educationvoters.org. David Lewis is currently the Director of Behavioral Health Services for Seattle Public Schools, a department that focuses on educational practices that align with social-emotional learning research and trauma-informed practices. David also works in collaboration with the University of Washington as a partner in research and lecturing in the content areas of complex trauma, adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, social-emotional learning, childhood resilience, and child neural and physical development. From 2006 to 2012, David led the field portions of the research study Middle School Support Program in collaboration with the University of Washington, Seattle Children's Hospital, and the Neshome Family Foundation. This research study was a pioneering project that validated the correlation between social-emotional health, environmental barriers that impact mental health, and their overall impact on student academic success. David is most publicly known for his expertise in the content areas of adverse childhood experiences, complex trauma, and toxic stress. David has developed a trauma-informed, multi-tiered system of support framework that Seattle Public Schools is implementing district-wide. The trauma-informed model is additionally launching in various communities throughout Washington State. For years, he has been developing assessment tools, treatment planning, as well as teaching and parenting practices that align with the complex trauma research. David frequently presents and translates the research throughout various parts of the country. Please welcome David Lewis.
Thank you. And in this short amount of time, I've got a lot of slides here, so I'll go through this. Will be very content driven, but as Eric said, there'll be time for questions at the end, but really to share out what we're doing here in Seattle, just centrally in our district, and really focusing on child development, social emotional learning, as well as ACEs and trauma.
Okay.
I think you took the pen out.
Let's see. I have to do this manually if need be. Okay.
Oh, here we go.
All
right, the objectives, we'll talk about trauma-informed multi-tiered system of support. What Seattle is doing is really focusing on the three-tiered triangle that's similar to PBIS, or we actually implement PBIS within our multi-tiered system of support. The science of learning, just how the brain learns. ACEs, complex trauma, you'll hear me talk a lot about relationships and resiliency. And then what we're scaling in our tier 2, a wraparound model to mitigate risk factors proactively for students. And right now we have 61 schools implementing practices related to trauma and ACEs, as well as our school climate. We're the largest district in the state, 103 schools next school year, and wraparound as a tier 2 proactive support and intervention for students. We have a theory of action that's really focused on our school climate, and what that's around is really anxiety and what are the conditions for learning for students, learning socially, emotionally, as well as academically, so integrating both academics and behavior. We wanted to improve our school culture and climate and build positive relationships with every student. We believe that if we can do that, we can increase our attendance, which means we have students sitting in seats accessing what's being taught. If our anxiety levels are down, then we can decrease in challenging behaviors because students actually have the ability to recognize emotions and then be taught skills and access skills to regulate those emotions, which should increase our learning time and academic gains. We are housed in this model. Many of you have probably seen triangles floating around of different types, but we wanted to be relentless in Tier 1, conditions best for teachers as well as students. If we can solidify a Tier 1 in a climate that's conducive to learning, where students want to be in, then students who need something additional will stick out more clearly in Tier 2 and Tier 3, and we can provide interventions and more targeted supports. And just as a start, what we wanted to do is provide a school environment that embodied these things. So physiological safety, safety overall, a sense of love and belonging. We want to build student self-esteem and allow them to become their best self. This is integral, what Maslow would say, for all people as well as students. And if we can contribute to these things in our school climate, what we have is lower cortisol levels, our anxiety chemical, and we can increase oxytocin, which is the chemical that you excrete when you feel like you're loved and you're cared about. And so from that perspective, we want our students to feel that way in our schools. When we talk about relationships, I often really focus on healthy and whole child development. A healthy and whole student is going to be a more effective student. At birth, we're this little baby that cries and reaches out because we need something, and that's an emotional reaction because we can't talk or do that ask yet. When there's somebody there for us that provides us getting our needs met, that's lots of practice of being able to regulate that emotion. And so a child who's told they're loved every day, hugged every day, their brain is already developing differently than a child who has not received that. And so as you look at this model, that's not our eyeballs looking for a relationship, that's actually our brain looking for a relationship. And so that's how vital that is. Even though we'd all say relationships are great, there is a science behind that. And so neuroembedding is also something that we've been focused on. Just how does the brain learn? Through repetition. And so a practice such as common expectations in your school building that are non-academic, we want to be teaching those relentlessly in September and October so that students are hardwiring what those expectations are and are building instincts around being able to meet those expectations successfully. And what that provides, what I say to schools, is a much easier and pleasant time from November through June because we've taken that time to be proactive in teaching our students those expectations. The more consistent, structured, and predictable environment is as well, we also know that contributes to lower anxiety levels. And so what this is depicting is the earlier the better. If we can be proactive and prevention-based in early childhood and our elementaries, then we really are sending a different brain to our middle schools and our high schools. And we have the ability to do that for those 36 hours a week that students are awake with us. And with that, those memories that students store in those early years creates a frame of reference. And that frame of reference really defines what world those students believe that they're living in. Are people trustworthy? Is the world a safe place? Are our schools safe? As well as what are our stereotypes, implicit bias, transference and countertransference, which is really our memories are dictating the way we interact and see people. And the way that we interact with each other elicits responses, which impacts behavior, academics, and so on between our teachers, students, and families. And so as we move into trauma, what we know is a student who's experienced ongoing trauma, that's contributing to that frame of reference. And so there's simple trauma, things such as a victim of a crime, a car accident, house fire, earthquake, physical injury, where you have an increase in adrenaline and cortisol, and then if you can get to safety, those chemicals then decrease and you go back to a normal baseline. If you're experiencing complex trauma and you're a child that's experiencing ongoing physical abuse, emotional neglect, sexual abuse, domestic violence in the home, family substance abuse, or placement disruptions, then you're sitting elevated in anxiety chemicals all of the time. It's a different trajectory of development and a different response. And so we're wanting to understand this because this greatly impacts our students. And so when we talk about a trauma-informed approach, I think trauma is the mechanism to get these conversations started, but I like to be clear to just say, hey, what we call a trauma-informed school should really just be school, which is a school that's safe for everybody, where students feel like they belong, where they have attached positive relationships with adults. That's good for a child who's experienced trauma or not. So what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you, even having that difference of a lens on students. In Seattle, we get calls from downtown of students who are presenting challenging behaviors, and a lot of times it's disciplinary action that's been implemented to address that. Well, now we get calls downtown where we still get the same information around those challenges of behaviors, but what we also get is, but what we know additionally is that the student has experienced various things in their life, and we want to be successful in keeping them. And what I say is the difference in just that lens means when they hang up the phone with me and they turn around and interact with that student, their practice is already different. And that's how valuable that is, to just have that understanding. So if we are more concrete around ACEs, these are the 10 original ACEs: physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, which is often more difficult to pick up on, physical or emotional, and then household dysfunction, violence in the home, mental illness, loss of a parent or caregiver, incarcerated relative, or substance abuse. And really the way this works is the more of these you have, the more impacted you are by, as a child. So growing up in a household ongoing with the two main categories, abuse and then neglect, and as I said earlier, neglect is sometimes not picked up on as well. Or if you're a student that internalizes and doesn't have challenging behaviors, you may be that student sitting in the back of the class with 25 or 30 other kids and not get the help you need. So another piece of this is, if the relationship and trust is in place with that student, then you also provide an opportunity for that student to ask for help and give you information that's going to be able to help them. So toxic stress is when you're experiencing these ongoing traumas. Stress is good 20 minutes at a time. If a danger were to present itself, we would flee, and the part of our brain that gets us to cry would signal us to move on and get to safety. But after about 20 minutes, adrenaline and cortisol would leave our system and we go to a normal baseline. If students are experiencing complex trauma or ACEs ongoing, they're sitting elevated all of the time, and that's toxic. What I say in a school context is, if a normal range of anxiety is 0 to 4, and on my way here I hit traffic a little bit, I went up to a 5, I still stay regulated. For students who are experiencing ongoing traumas or ACEs, they may wake up in the morning and already be at a 7 or 8, which I say is that's 2 or 3 points away from already having some challenging behaviors in your school. And so what is the school environment that we can create that when students wake up in the morning, if they are elevated, when they show up to school, they move to a normal range, because we're providing the safety, consistency, and predictability for them, which is going to put them in position to better regulate their emotions and not have some of those challenging behaviors. Now here's a more comprehensive list. I won't go through the whole thing, but I know the PowerPoint will be sent out. But this was just survey work where we asked families and students, what are other additional happenings in your life that cause you to be stressed to the extent that it interrupts your day-to-day well-being? And these are some of the things that came out. This number here, student mobility, is our number in Seattle Public Schools of students that have been designated McKinney-Vento or homeless, and that number is over 3,000 now. And so what are those children's experience day to day, as well as when they show up to our school buildings? We want to understand that and provide some consistency for them. So the result of this is, if you're experiencing ongoing trauma or stressors and ongoing anxiety, you're relying on your amygdala to keep you on alert. So you're getting lots of stimulation and development there. If your brain can't relax, then you're not accessing your prefrontal cortex to the same extent, which is gives us our ability to slow down, process, and think, and then hopefully have a behavior that's appropriate in a given context. Then our students can look much more impulsive, and they could have challenging behaviors because of that. So essentially, they could be triggered, hippocampus, where memories come in before they disperse through other parts of our brain. Our students can be triggered in some way, not have access to their prefrontal cortex in that given moment. And that is a physiological response, not always a well thought out, challenging behavior that they're presenting to you. And so the practice around this is really us being able to recognize that, keep ourselves regulated so we can de-escalate that student as opposed to power struggling with them in that moment. And I throw this in because something else that comes up is just for students who need something more targeted or additional. This is a slide that just shows what our DSM-4 says is ADHD or ADD. These are the symptoms. And on the other side, what our Center for Disease Control says are symptoms of complex trauma or ongoing anxiety. And they look very similar. And so what I say is they both exist, but we want to be able to get information from our students and families to be accurate on, is this something that's genetic or organic, or is it things that are happening in the environment that are leading to us seeing these symptoms or behaviors. And so if we have students that are dealing with lots of things in their life, it really is consistency and predictability they need. Cognitive load, there's a researcher named John Sweller that says our brains can hold 3 or 4 things at a given time. And once you get beyond that, you're not retaining information as well. And so if our school buildings are consistent and predictable, when we teach that student math, if we can move math to number 1 or 2 on that list, it's going to be retained for that brain much more successfully than if it's number 5 or 6, because the student is navigating inconsistent environments out of school, inconsistency in school, and then we're putting academics on top of that. And so things like common expectations that are explicit, that we're teaching, common responses from adults, getting the anxiety levels down so that brain that's not full of anxiety can actually retain the learning. That's really what we want to shoot for in being proactive in this. So our structures, and what we know is teachers have their own personalities, adults in our buildings as well as students, but what are our anchors in our school building that are our stoplights for students? And then what are our choices in between that, or our agency that we're going to give students a little bit of, so that they're not seeking control in other places, which is back to our system again. If we can provide consistency over time, what I say is if your signal for students to gather for learning is raising your hand in kindergarten for every classroom, that student moves to first grade, the signal to gather for learning is raising your hand. By the time they get to 2nd or 3rd grade, you could have a brand new teacher in the classroom that raises their hand on day 1, and you have students that are already going to know what that expectation is. And if you just gain 5 minutes of learning every day from that, you've gained 100 minutes over the course of a month. But that's how far consistency and predictability can go. And if we can do that, these dots depict students, and that sort of umbrella is our threshold for tier 1. So below that is a consistent, predictable, trustworthy environment. We'll have more students that are able to remain there. And we may differentiate a little bit in that. But if we can do that, I visited a school where one kid started to poke and there was no expectation set. Then the next thing you know, another student started to poke. And then we had 8 students poking each other. If 3 months goes by, we have 8 kids that can't keep their hands to themselves. But if we're teaching to what it means to meet those expectations at carpet time where they're not poking, we may only have 1 student doing that, and that may be the student that needs something additional. And so it's our common expectations and our system that's holding some of those behaviors in place. And that's how that works. And then we have the time and capacity to get those students exactly what they need, the 1 or the 2, and not the 8 or 9. And then for tier 2, a concrete practice we're doing is we're being proactive in wanting to identify what risk factors are for students. So ACEs, looking at academics, is it something going on with the family, social, legal, identify what those risk factors are, and partner with school, community, and family to recognize what the symptoms are, and then additionally with a team approach, put a protective factor in place. And so we want to do that early in the year. We want to be proactive in that. And we want to be able to partner with families. We need information from families because they know their students more than anybody else. And so that's a practice that we're doing as students move up in that pyramid into tier 2. Something else we're looking at building research around is authoritative teaching practices. This is evidence informed out of positive discipline. But if you look at the definition of authoritative, able to be trusted, reliable, sound, authentic, valid, that goes a long way for all students as well as students who need consistency because they've experienced trauma or ACEs. Clear and precise expectations and directives, giving directives with an awareness of our own expression so we're not triggering students. Being able to give a directive that's tied to a common expectation, step away and hold the line so we're not power struggling. Strength-based approaches, putting our students in position to feel successful at meeting expectations. And so if we have common expectations, what we have some teachers doing is walking students to the expectation, saying, hey, I care about you and I know you can do this. I'm going to hold a high expectation for you, but I'm going to provide high support as well. So we have the relationship intact and we're relying on our system to help students feel successful and we're guiding them there. As we look at social emotional learning, you know, there's students that have experienced ACEs or trauma where they're not acting out, but they have more of a shutdown response. How do we put them in position to be able to meet those expectations and the skills of collaborative learning or participating in class, for example? What we did is we're building out being able to be concrete around what those actual practice goals are. And we had a student who wouldn't participate in class. Her anxiety levels would actually go sky high where she would shut down. So we gave her 3 questions every class that she knew, which made it predictable and consistent for her. She knew she could prepare her answers, and when she was called upon for 6 weeks, she felt really successful in speaking out and giving those answers. After 6 weeks, we removed the questions and said, hey, but you're still going to be called upon, so be prepared. She was called upon, she was prepared, and then she was speaking. And then after 12 weeks, we didn't tell her anything, but we had equipped her with the ability to collaboratively learn and speak up in class and lower her anxiety level in a targeted manner. So we do want to get concrete beyond just the ACEs content and being able to provide practices to schools as well as educators. And if we can do that, I'm going back to this slide, in addition to bringing those targeted supports, we will actually have students that'll come back to our adults as well and give us information. And so somebody sent me this picture here where I have a sweater vest on because I wore sweater vest a lot back in the day. But there was a student that came to me and he was getting in trouble in the community. He said, you know, but I want to do the right thing. And he showed up a week later after our talk and he had a sweater vest on. He was showing up to school every day with the ability to regulate himself and be in the classroom and learn. That student had the biggest gains on all academic categories, state assessments, as well as MAP testing at the end of the year. I hadn't seen him for a while, and someone came to me and said, hey, have you seen student A? And I said, I haven't seen him. They said he was presenting in the Tacoma Dome on the power of a relationship and how you stick things out and you keep working hard. And so, but that was a student who came back. And that's it. I know that was a lot of content, but hopefully you're able to track, and I know the PowerPoint will be sent out as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, David. And yes, we will be sending out this recording. It'll go out to you if you're registered. We'll also have it posted on our website, educationvoters.org, under the previous webinars tab under Get Involved. And so now we've got about 10 minutes for questions. It's now your turn. If you have a question, just type your questions in the chat feature, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. No question is too basic. So David, I'm going to kick us off by asking, where is this work being done? Because I know that you're in the Seattle Public School District, but are there any other districts anywhere that are doing anything like this?
There are various districts who have funding, from what I'm most aware of, for feeder patterns or 5 schools here or there. But the best of my knowledge, Seattle Public Schools is the first that has taken general funding to actually build a department. This department's about 1.5 years old, and actually said, we're going to make this part of what we do, district-wide, 100 schools. And so but I am involved in other parts of the country in a select number of schools.
Is there any kind of pushback that you're hearing from districts, or is it just not knowing that this work even exists?
I think it's a combination of both. I think a lot of the trauma work has really been content related, and so I think it is on us as the implementers to continue to develop out successful practices to be able to give educators in schools to be able to actually do something about it, and we're working on that.
Great. What kind of results are you seeing from this work? Has it been showing up in terms of discipline numbers or anything else?
Yeah, well, in the early stages, a lot of our focus has been on school climate. So a lot of districts do the climate survey, some sort of climate survey with students towards the end of the year. In the late spring, you get the results in summer, and then you had your oldest students leave and adults are off in summer. We actually had 60 schools do the climate survey multiple times per year. So a question like adults in my school care about me, we wanted to know the results of that in October. So the schools that did that and had numbers that were not above 50%, what we said is how can we get that number up? And for schools that have moved that up to the 80, 90th%, what we're seeing is attendance is increasing. My belief is we have students that are less anxious at school. Those are the schools where students are going to adults to say, hey, I need some additional help. And in the schools that have done that, we are seeing some early results around smarter balanced math, which is what we're calling some of our positive outlier schools, but it's still early in the stages of that. In terms of discipline, we are seeing that our discipline numbers are down, but we want to dig into that a little bit more. So.
Great, yeah, that's wonderful. And we're wondering whether or not there are any other impacts that you see on other assessments besides the SBAC.
Yeah, well, the climate survey is big because what we're doing is we're saying we want to understand the perspective of our students. And when we talk about anxiety, when we talk about relationships, really that's where the students can have their voice in that. And so we are seeing some increases at various schools on our climate surveys. And again, we're just trying to triangulate that data with more tangible things such as academics or attendance or discipline.
Excellent. How does this research apply to college students? Is there anything being done like this in universities?
In terms of implementation or providing the information to the universities?
I would say both.
Well, I know I'm at University of Washington every quarter. I lecture up there quite a bit on this, and a lot of those lectures are equipping adults that are moving out into helping profession fields, including our school teachers. In terms of implementing for students, once students are 19, 20, they move sort of out of the ACEs realm because ACEs is 0 to 18. But I do think there is information that's relevant around just anxiety levels and performance for college students. And so my guess is the work's going to be moving that direction as well.
Great. How can the legislature support this work?
Well, I think that, again, trauma has been sort of the mechanism to really understand students, how the brain develops, how anxiety impacts students. But I think the legislature is important because what we're really trying to do is transform some of our schools and look at safety, consistency, predictability, some of those things that are really the conditions for allowing a student to have those academic gains that we need. And so really a balanced approach to say, hey, the whole child is really what direction we need to move into.
Great. Do you think some legislation might be useful to provide some funding for this on a more widespread basis?
Yeah, very useful, yes.
Great. Does the assessment environment for students fully match the needs for students who are dealing with trauma and ACEs? Do we need to change the way we're doing assessments, do you think?
From my personal opinion, I think information is good. I think information directly from students is valuable because we're all experts in ourselves. But there's questions that come up about the number of assessments students are taking, to what extent an assessment really digs in on a student. And so I think it really just depends.
I wonder what some of the ACEs work looks like on the ground. You talk about providing structure, providing an expectation, and then you had a slide where it said to set the expectation, and instead of engaging in a power struggle, step back. What would that look like in a classroom?
Yeah, you know, that is actually a practice we've had multiple teachers implementing with some success. So when you talk about the student who's dysregulated, where they're not really having the ability in that moment to slow down, process, and think, what I say is you still want to hold an expectation for them. So if you're teaching them and naming the expectation, and then you step away and allow their brain to regulate itself, and the expectation is still there, what we've seen is a lot of times it'll take 2 or 3 minutes, but that student will come join the group or whatever that expectation was. And then our teachers who have had a short memory and just been able to move on with their day, the next time they're interacting with that student, instead of it taking 3 minutes, it's taking 1. And then as time goes on, you're setting the expectation for that student that hasn't budged, then immediately they're just able to meet that.
So you would basically give the student a timeout or a chance to like sit on a couch or something until he or she is feeling ready to learn and then come back to the class?
Giving them that 2 or 3 minutes as opposed to a 10-minute power struggle, because then we've gained 7 minutes of teaching and learning for all students, and we still allow that student to come back and join the group and learn as well.
Here's a question that's interesting. If there's a child that fits these descriptions who's in the Seattle Public School District, how can someone help that child to make sure that they're getting the support that they need? So if their teacher isn't necessarily recognizing it, say I'm a parent volunteer or maybe a paraeducator, and you see a child that might be an ACEs kid, for lack of a better term, what's the procedure for getting the support for that child?
Yeah, I think it would be what are the symptoms that are identifying that student as an ACEs kid, so we don't want to assume they are, but if they're displaying challenges that are interfering with their day-to-day learning experience, what are those identifiable factors? And then again, as I showed in some of the slides, we want to have a systems approach on saying what's the information from that parent volunteer that's valuable, what's the information from the teacher, what's the information from the family, who are the players that can give us information to inform why those symptoms may be happening, and then how do we together in a systems way come up with a resolve or protective factors and put those in place as that child moves forward.
Wonderful. We've got time for about 2 more questions after this one, which is this sort of research being taught in teacher preparation programs around the state or even around the country right now?
Yeah, as far as I know, some of my direct work has been with Seattle Teacher Residency. So I present to them, we're actually looking for a date in August. So teachers that are in their programs, moving into many of our schools, what the results of that has really been is they've said it's valuable understanding for just what kids are coming to school with. And then as we build out practices such as those authoritative practices, just giving them some additional tools so that they can be successful when they start their career. So I at least know that's happening in the Seattle area.
That's great. Do you think there may be some movement in Eastern Washington, like either at Wazoo or at Whitworth or any of the schools there, Heritage maybe?
Yes, well, I know Washington State has Chris Blodgett, who's doing a lot with ACEs and trauma, as well as Lincoln High, which was in the Paper Tigers movie. And so, you know, it takes time and resources, but I do think we're moving in that direction.
Great. Are there requirements to be able to go into the schools and work as a social emotional learning facilitator? And do facilitators ever work with social workers?
Yeah, well, I have a team who's through behavioral health services, and the far majority of my team are social workers. And so I think what that's signaling is all of it is important. So for the child, the whole child approach, academics, social emotional development, and behavior are important to look at. And so I think on the implementation side, we want teachers that are teaching good academics. We also want representation from social emotional, you know, people who have a background in social emotional learning to also be able to contribute to the systems that those students are sitting in each day.
We have one more question, which is, where can we go to learn how to work with adults with ACEs? And for children, how do you work with the parents of ACEs kids?
Well, the ACEs research shows that a lot of times ACEs can be handed down through generations. And so there's that saying I put up there that said, what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. There's a lot of times where there's meetings, believe it or not, that can be contentious between families and schools, especially when a child is presenting, you know, challenges day to day. A practice I've used is really just asking the family, help me better understand your experience, and I'll sit back and listen. And just that alone has put families in position to share things that are integral to understand why that child is presenting those challenges, which then moves us closer to being able to recognize what the triggers are. And then again, back into that wraparound model, have the input from the family, the teacher, the social worker, or whoever else to take that information from the family and put protective factors in place and build a holistic plan. And so really it's listening and also providing information to the families to better understand ACEs, so that 6 hours of the school day we do what we do, but when we come up with that more targeted plan, we're also handing the family something they can do in those evening hours that they could feel successful at, and also give that child a successful repetition of doing something pro-social throughout the evening.
It's all interconnected, isn't it?
It's all interconnected, yes.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, David. There will be a recording of this on our website, educationvoters.org, and we'll also have the presentation slides as well, so you're welcome to share that with your networks. Our next LEVinar will take place this coming Tuesday, July 25th at 12:30 p.m. League of Education Voters Director of Policy and Government Relations, Daniel Zavala, will explain the state's new $7.3 billion school funding agreement and answer your questions. Registration information will soon be up on our website, educationvoters.org. We should have that up in about an hour or so or less. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. If you have additional questions, please send them to me, Arik, spelled A-R-I-K, at educationvoters.org, or you can send them to info@educationvoters.org. As I said, a recording of today's presentation will be available on the website, and do feel free to share. Thanks again for attending, and we hope you will join us at future LEVinars.